Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll be going over the history and geography of the Solomon Islands. Sorry, I was really enjoying that sound. Anyway, the Solomon Islands, let me get my pencil. They are located in Oceania in what is known as Melanesia. So right over here is Papua New Guinea. You can see can you see? There we go, the boundary line of Papua New Guinea to the Solomon Islands right there. This is Bougainville, which is, shadows. There we go. This is Bougainville. It's an autonomous region of Papua New Guinea, so, technically Papua New Guinea, but not quite. And here is where the Solomon Islands begin, just over here. So Bougainville is part of this chain of islands, but it's not politically part of the Solomon Islands, if that makes any sense. So, the Solomon Islands has 6 main islands and approximately 900 or so smaller ones, including reefs, atolls, all those wonderful things we find out in the Pacific Ocean. The Solomon Sea is this area of the Pacific Ocean right here. Further down, I don't think you can see, is the Coral Sea. And these islands are volcanic. It's part of the Ring of Fire. And if you notice, all these main islands are in one big strip. They go like this. So once upon a time, back in ancient times, this was basically all raised land. And it's possible that, I'm getting ahead of myself, when people moved onto the islands, they could have just walked from island to island, basically. And then once the ice caps melt, floods with water, we get the New Georgia Sound right in between there. There's, all sorts of different little straits in between all the little islands and things. So, like I said, it is volcanic, but there aren't really any active volcanoes on the land itself. There are some very active volcanoes underwater around here or so, but all the ones on land are basically dormant at this point. So let me go through each of the islands for you. We have this one up here. Now the French speaker in me wants to say Choiseul, but it's pronounced Choiseul. This is Choiseul Island. Down here we have New Georgia, the New Georgia group as well. This is all part of New Georgia. We have Santa Isabel. We have Guadalcanal up here, Malaita, and San Cristobal. Those are the main 6 islands. There's also, as you can see over here, the Santa Cruz Islands. These islands, if you're going here from San Cristobal, are way farther down south, kind of southeast this way. They're very, very isolated, very remote islands, but they are technically, part of the Solomon Islands. And then there's also Rennell and Bellona, which you can see down here. Make sure you can. Yep. This is Rennell. There's Bellona right there. Rennell Island's really interesting because they have this big Lake Tengano right here. Super cool. It was used a lot during World War II, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The capital city is Honiara, right here on Guadalcanal. My mouth is really clicky tonight. I wonder if you can hear that. Guadalcanal also has the highest point. It is right here. It is Mount Popo Manaseu, another extinct volcano. Malaita is actually the most populous island, but Guadalcanal has the most arable land. It's the best island for farming. There's even a gold mine on it. And let's see. An interesting thing about Malaita is that there is a group of people that have blonde hair. They have very dark skin and bright blonde hair, blue eyes. It's really interesting. Also over here on Choiseul, we have people who have some of the darkest skin in the world. It's so beautiful. But I think that's all I want to go over with geography for now. I'll probably point out some other few things as we go through its history. So, like I said, the earliest peoples most likely just walked onto the islands from a land bridge. The earliest found settlements are from approximately 30,000 BCE. The earliest known settlements on Guadalcanal, which actually resembled like homes and towns and things, was from approximately 4500 BCE. The Lapita culture arrived probably around 1200 BCE. That was a group of Austronesian people who, traveled by boats, think like Moana, and mixed with the people already here. And like I wanted to mention in geography, but it's more part of history. It's during this time period that many different ethnic groups developed on each of these islands. So there's around 70 or maybe even around 100 different ethno-linguistic groups, which means they have their own language and their own culture. They're completely different from peoples on the other islands. It's really important to its history. So skipping ahead, the first European contact was on the island of Santa Isabel. It was in 1568 from a Spanish explorer who was coming from Peru. His name was Alvaro de Mendaña. And when he landed here, he assumed that these islands would be full of riches. So he named them after King Solomon. And that's how we get the name Solomon Islands. Spoiler alert, these islands are not filled with like gems and riches. Like there is gold, but not like excessive amounts of gold or anything like that. The Spanish came by constantly trying to colonize, but pretty much every time something went horribly wrong. Mostly in that the people attacked and fought back. The Spanish were overcome by the weather or even like diseases from the peoples that lived here. Really interesting. Where is it? It's over here. It's Vonavona Lagoon is a headhunter island, or not. It's like an atoll. It's like a sandbar, and they would as headhunters, they would cut off the heads of their enemies and line up their skulls all around, which are still there today. Very interesting. But these people did not want the Spanish around, and they fought back with all they had and basically chased off the Spanish. They went up to the Philippines up there. So in 1767, some British explorers come, and not long after that, some French explorers. You can imagine what happened to them. Pretty much the same thing that happened to the Spanish. They got chased off. In the late 18th century, though, there was some trade with whaling ships from Britain, from Australia, from the United States. They would land here and resupply ships. They would trade. Sometimes it would be very amicable, but at the end of the day, it wasn't always great. The British mainly tried to set up little like whaling stations on the shorelines so that there would be like permanent whaling spots, but as you might have guessed, the islanders chased them off and pretty much murdered whoever was in charge of setting up those towns and colonies. And then very sadly, in the 1840s was the start of a process, I suppose, known as blackbirding, where people, mainly from like Australia, Britain, even like the US, to their territories and the islands around here, would come and tell these islanders, like, we have a great job opportunity for you. Just hop on board our ship and we'll take you to a really, really good place to work. And they basically would con people into working slave labor on plantations and would not allow them to leave and kept them as slaves. It was a really horrific time, and it continued for a really long time. Sometimes people were just straight up kidnapped or forced to go against their will. Really devastating. They would go to Australia, to Samoa, to Fiji. As time went on during this blackbirding situation, the islanders would become even more violent than they were before. Various religious groups, I suppose, would come to try to build missions on the island. You can imagine what happened to them. There were some that were very successful, and today the islands are very predominantly Christian. So some missionaries were a little bit more successful than the others. Most of them were just chased off violently. So 1884 rolls around, and if you've seen pretty much all my videos on Africa, You know what happened in 1884 in Germany? Basically, like, it was known as the Scramble for Africa, where everyone got together and all the major powers of Europe got together in Germany and basically spread out a map of Africa and laid claim. Germany also laid claim to pretty much all of these islands over here. And Britain wound up having like a sphere of influence kind of thing over the southern islands. So they didn't control them at first, but they were like in charge of them. But after extensive blackbirding was occurring, and just because Britain didn't want Germany to start hopping over, in 1893, it became a British protectorate. That's the word. The Southern Islands became a British protectorate. In 1899, Germany ceded the Northern Islands to Britain. And as you can imagine what would happen, the islanders weren't very keen on these white people coming to their island and saying that they owned them, so they would fight back. The British would come with their full military force and fight back because, you know, legally they owned the islands. And it was a big back and forth between them. Basically, like, the British owned them, but they couldn't really control them. It remained, like, in British terms, like a backwater corner of the globe where people would still live in, like, grass huts and were very violent, things like that. But then everything changed very quickly in 1942 when the War in Pacific kicked off in full swing in World War II. Japan came and occupied a lot of the southern islands here. They started setting up base on Guadalcanal. The Allies had a big, like, the Battle of Guadalcanal is one of, like, the most famous World War II battles in the Pacific. The Allies came and managed to conquer the island and liberate all the other islanders in the area here. And, you know, this is like the first time in history that they weren't chased off violently. They are very grateful for the American forces there. The Americans started building an army base in what would become Honiara. And very important, like I said, Malaita is the most populous island, right? A lot of people came from Malaita to Guadalcanal to help out with the war effort and to help, you know, build this town that the Americans are using. And a lot of them stayed long after the war. So the American legacy is that they basically founded the city of Honiara and also spread the Pidgin language. So if you don't know, Pidgin is it's different. It's kind of like, you know, how Creole is. There's not like one form of Creole. There's different forms of Creoles all around the world. The Creole language, I should say. Pidgin is like a mishmash language of, in this case, English and tribal words. So, like I said in the beginning, all of these islands had different ethnicities, different languages. They were completely different cultures, and this was the first time they were actually coming together for something. So they could not communicate. They spoke completely different language. So Pidgin united them because they could all learn to speak that. And it was the first time, especially between Malaita and Guadalcanal, that these people first really started merging their cultures together. In 1943, there was a movement for autonomy from Britain, which Britain was not a fan of. Once it started really building up steam, the British came and arrested the leaders of the movement, which people were not happy about, and there was widespread civil disobedience. So, people weren't driving buses or operating anything in protest. And it effectively worked. By 1960, preparations for independence started to come from Britain, and after a lot of constitutional bumps, ups and downs, renegotiations, eventually on July 7th, 1978, the Solomon Islands were granted independence from Britain. I'm sorry if you don't like the clicky voice. I don't know what it is. I've drank a lot of water today, so I don't know why my voice is so clicky, but some people are into that. I don't know. Anyway. So, like I've said now a couple times, each island had their own culture and language, very different ethnic groups, and now they were all lumped together in one country. So that started a lot of ethnic trouble, so to say, where someone would be, like elected, like prime minister. Oh, I should say that Queen Elizabeth II is still the Queen of the Solomon Islands. There's a prime minister and, all of that, but she's technically the Queen of the Islands still to this day. The Governor General of the Solomon Islands represents her on the island, so she doesn't have to rule from there because she's Queen Elizabeth II. But anyway, I lost my train of thought. There was a lot of ethnic tension, so to say, where maybe someone who's Malayan would be elected prime minister, and the people of Guadalcanal wouldn't like that, and there would be a lot of back and forth. Pretty much almost all prime ministers of the Solomon Islands were removed with a vote of no confidence, and then a new one would be elected, and then they would be removed. There's a lot of corruption. It was just what back in the day the UN would classify as a failed state, where independence was granted and it just never really kicked off. And it really, really came to a head in 1998 in an event that's known as the tensions, where the ethnic tension between Malayans and the people of Guadalcanal became violent. So a lot of Malayans, like I said, moved to Guadalcanal during World War II and not long after, because, like I said in the beginning, Guadalcanal has the most arable land. It had the capital city. It had the most jobs, and Malaya had the most people. So a lot of people hopped over. And people from Guadalcanal, especially in the more remote regions, away from the major city, became really upset that there were Malayans in their backyard stealing their homes and their land. So it became violent, and the Malayans fought back, and there were militias fighting back and forth. It was a full-on civil war between these two people on this island. By 2001, the country basically experienced economic collapse because of the civil war happening. The government, which once again the leaders were constantly being removed with a vote of no confidence, there was very nearly a full-on coup at various times throughout this time, but not an official, the militia would sweep in and remove the prime minister or anything. But the government during all this time was desperately asking Australia mainly for help, because they were so overwhelmed by these militias, and they weren't given it until 2003, when finally police from Australia and New Zealand and other Pacific islands came and fought. Basically, a lot of people lost their lives during this conflict, but got the the main antagonist from Guadalcanal to surrender and ended the civil war. And since then, the government has been pretty not 100% stable. There is still a lot of government corruption accusations, at least. There's still a lot of times where the leaders were removed with a vote of no confidence. And then in 2006, it was revealed just how much China had an economic influence over the islands. And there are a lot of corruption charges against the leaders with China. So there were attacks on the Chinatown in Honiara, attacks against Chinese people. And, China got involved. They evacuated Chinese people from the islands. And, it doesn't go on to this day, but there's still a lot of Chinese influence on the Solomon Islands to this day. So anyway, basically, while the government may not be 100% stable, it is at least peaceful, and that's the good news. So when there's peace, that means that the economy can build and people can have better lives. So yeah, it's a really interesting place, because there's some places that aren't inhabited even, but there's some places that have full-on remote tribes that, still live in grass huts and have their traditional ways. There's some places that are very developed. You can see all the little airports here. My cat just woke up. And it's just a really, like I said, there's all these ethnic groups. So it's a very mixed bag of all of these different Melanesian cultures. It's really fantastic and really interesting. And, we're excited to see where the Solomon Islands will go after this. So that's the end of our video tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I really hope that you have a very good night. Good night.